How historically accurate are Mafia game? We're gonna mainly look at the first one for this video. Let's start. At its core, the game captures the fundamental structure of gang hierarchies with remarkable precision. Unlike romanticized Hollywood portrayals, this game shows the Mafia as a highly organized social system with intricate rules, strict codes of conduct, and a pyramid-like power structure. The family isn't just a criminal organization. It's a surrogate family with deep cultural roots, particularly within Italian-American communities. The concept of omertà, the code of silence, is brilliantly portrayed in the game. Members are bound by an unwritten yet ironclad set of rules that prioritize loyalty above everything else. Betrayal means more than just losing a job. It could mean death. The game demonstrates how this code wasn't just a criminal tactic, but a complex social contract that defined entire communities. Recruitment in these gangs wasn't random. The game accurately shows how criminal organizations specifically targeted young men from economically marginalized communities, particularly second-generation immigrants who felt disconnected from mainstream society. These individuals saw the gang as both an economic opportunity and a path to social mobility during a time of extreme economic hardship. The territorial nature of gang culture comes through strongly. Each neighborhood was a carefully defended economic ecosystem. Turf wasn't just about physical space. It represented economic control, social influence, and cultural identity. The game depicts how violent territorial disputes were less about personal vendettas and more about strategic economic control. Protection rackets, a cornerstone of gang economic models, are represented with nuanced complexity. It wasn't just about threatening businesses. It was a sophisticated economic system where protection was essentially a form of localized taxation. Businesses paid not out of pure fear, but because the gang provided actual security and economic stability that local law enforcement often couldn't. The game also does an exceptional job showing how gang culture was deeply intertwined with political structures. These weren't just criminal groups. They were complex social networks that influenced everything from local elections to urban development. Politicians, law enforcement, and criminal organizations existed in a symbiotic relationship far more complicated than simple bribery. Family connections weren't just a romantic notion. They were a critical survival mechanism. The game shows how criminal organizations operated like extended kinship networks, with blood relations and close community ties forming the backbone of their operational structure. Trust was currency, and bloodlines were the strongest form of that currency. Violence in the game is portrayed not as random aggression, but as a calculated tool of governance. Hits weren't just about revenge. They were strategic decisions designed to maintain order, send messages, and reinforce the hierarchical structure of the organization. Economic survival drove most gang activities. Prohibition created a unique economic environment where illegal activities became not just profitable, but essential for community survival. The game captures how these criminal organizations provided economic opportunities during a time of extreme social and economic instability. The generational aspect of gang culture is subtly but effectively depicted. Young men weren't just recruited. They were groomed, with skills and cultural knowledge passed down like a complex, dangerous inheritance. The game shows how criminal culture was a complete lifestyle, not just a career choice. What makes this portrayal so compelling is its rejection of simple good versus evil narratives. These weren't just criminals. They were complex social actors navigating an incredibly challenging social landscape. Let's talk about extortion thing. Extortion wasn't just some random muscle work. In Mafia games, they actually nail the multi-layered hustle of protection rackets. These weren't just pay me or else scenarios. We're talking sophisticated economic manipulation that was basically a shadow economy running parallel to legitimate business. Small businesses were the primary targets, and the game Loki gets the psychological warfare just right. It wasn't about pure intimidation. It was strategic pressure. Imagine you're a restaurant owner. These guys don't just threaten you. They create scenarios where protection feels like the only logical survival option. They'd start by showing what could go wrong, accidentally breaking a window, having a mysterious fire, or having some unfortunate customers cause trouble. The economic model was wild. These rackets functioned more like a messed-up insurance system. Pay the fee, and you get guaranteed safety, smoother business operations, and sometimes even actual protection from other criminal groups. It was less about violence and more about creating a perception of inevitable cooperation. Different neighborhoods had different extortion rates. The game captures how these weren't random. They were meticulously calculated based on business type, location, and potential profit margins. A high-end restaurant might pay more than a small corner store. It was basically economic engineering with a criminal twist. What most people don't realize, and what Mafia games sometimes miss, is how bureaucratic these operations were. These weren't just street-level thugs. We're talking about organized systems with paperwork, schedules, and strategic planning. Some of these protection racket operations were more professionally run than actual legitimate businesses. The psychological manipulation was next level. Business owners weren't just scared. They were often psychologically groomed to see these criminal groups as necessary protectors. It wasn't pure fear. It was a complex Stockholm Syndrome-type relationship where paying became almost comfortable. Restaurant and bar owners were prime targets. Why? Consistent cash flow, high foot traffic, and easy-to-manipulate supply chains. The game captures how these businesses were essentially cash conversion machines that criminal groups could easily exploit. Interestingly, these rackets weren't just about immediate cash. They were long-term investment strategies. Control a business, and you control its entire economic ecosystem. Need a place to launder money? Cool. Want a front for other operations? Even better. The most accurate part? How these rackets were deeply integrated with local political structures. Paying protection money wasn't just a criminal transaction. It was a complex social negotiation that often involved local politicians, law enforcement, and community leaders. What Mafia games sometimes oversimplify is the cultural nuance. These weren't just transactions. They were intricate social rituals with unspoken rules, respect protocols, and generational traditions. It was less about pure crime and more about a complex social system of economic survival. Real talk. These protection rackets were basically the original startup ecosystem of marginalized communities. Brutal? Absolutely. But also a sophisticated economic survival mechanism during incredibly challenging times. Now, let's break down the real deal about Mafia hierarchy. How Mafia games stack up against the actual criminal org chart of the 1930s. First off, the game's got the pyramid structure pretty much on point. We're talking a seriously layered organization that was more corporate than most people realize. It wasn't just a bunch of tough guys. This was a well-oiled machine with clear career paths and promotion tracks. At the top, the boss, or Don, in Italian-American contexts. In the game and real life, this wasn't just a title. This was the ultimate decision-maker, the strategic mastermind who rarely got his hands dirty. Think less violent gangster, more corporate CEO with some seriously questionable business practices. The underboss was the real operational backbone. In both the game and reality, this was the number two who managed day-to-day operations. They were the bridge between the boss and the street-level guys, handling the complex internal politics and keeping everything running smooth. Capo roles are where the game gets super interesting. These mid-level managers were running specific territories or business lines. Each capo was essentially a mini-boss with their own crew, responsible for generating revenue and maintaining order in their specific domain. The game captures the entrepreneurial spirit of these roles. They weren't just muscle, they were strategic operators. Soldiers, or made men, are where things get real. In the game and real life, these weren't just random muscle. Becoming a made man was a complex ritual. We're talking about a lifetime commitment that was more about cultural initiation than just criminal recruitment. The game nails how this wasn't just a job. It was the entire lifestyle and identity. The associate level is where most people misunderstand Mafia structure. These weren't full members, but crucial economic players. The game shows how associates were essentially the flexible workforce, contractors who could be valuable without full insider status. What most portrayals miss, and what Mafia games sometimes oversimplify, is the incredible bureaucratic nature of these organizations. We're talking about groups with more internal regulations than most legitimate businesses. There were precise rules about everything: who could be approached, how disputes were settled, how money was distributed. Family connections weren't just a cute narrative detail. They were the entire operational framework. The game captures how these weren't just criminal groups, but extended kinship networks with complex internal dynamics. Blood ties and cultural connections were the real currency of power. The most accurate part? How promotion wasn't just about being the most violent. It was about strategic thinking, economic contribution, and maintaining the complex social ecosystem of the organization. The game shows how becoming a higher-level member was more about political maneuvering than just being a good shooter. Interestingly, the internal conflict mechanisms are pretty spot on. These organizations had incredibly sophisticated ways of managing internal disputes. It wasn't just about who could punch hardest. It was about maintaining the overall stability of the organization. Also, was police corrupt too? I mean more corrupt. Historical context. Drop. The 1930s were basically the Wild West of law enforcement. We're talking about a period where institutional corruption wasn't just a possibility. It was practically standard operating procedure. Chicago was ground zero for police corruption. Statistically speaking, about 70% of Chicago police departments had direct financial connections with organized crime during Prohibition. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented historical fact. Cops weren't just occasionally taking bribes. They were actively integrated into criminal economic structures. Let's break down the corruption mechanics. Police salaries during the Great Depression were laughably low. An average cop made around $2,000 annually, which is roughly $40,000 in today's money. Compare that to what criminal organizations were offering for a single favor, and suddenly taking bribes looks mathematically logical. Prohibition created this insane economic ecosystem where law enforcement became a negotiable service. Criminal organizations weren't just paying off individual cops, they were systematically compromising entire departmental structures. We're talking about payroll systems so complex they'd make modern corporate accounting look simple. FBI records from that era reveal something wild. In major cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, anywhere between 40 to 60% of police departments had documented cases of systematic corruption. These weren't just isolated incidents. This was institutional. The game's portrayal of cops being more like mobile revenue generators for criminal groups? Scarily accurate. Police weren't just occasionally corrupt. They were functioning as another economic layer in the criminal ecosystem. Key historical fact. In 1931, the Wickersham Commission, a presidential investigation, basically confirmed what everyone already knew. Law enforcement wasn't just ineffective, it was actively participating in criminal economies. Political connections made this even more complex. Many police commanders were directly elected or appointed through political machines that had their own criminal connections. So cops weren't just individually corrupt. The entire system was designed for compromise. Racial dynamics added another layer of complexity. Minority communities experienced even more extreme forms of police corruption, with law enforcement essentially functioning as an additional oppressive economic force. The most accurate part of Mafia games? Showing how taking a bribe wasn't seen as morally wrong, but as a standard career enhancement strategy. Cops weren't thinking about being bad, they were navigating an economic survival system. Interesting stat. Between 1920 to 1940, approximately 15 to 20% of police budgets in major cities were estimated to come indirectly from criminal protection money. We're talking about systematic economic integration, not just random bribes. The game captures something profound. Law enforcement wasn't an opposing force to criminal organizations. They were a negotiable, movable economic component in a much larger system of power distribution. Now is landscape on point or miss? The 1930s Chicago was literally a living, breathing ecosystem of economic chaos, social transformation, and urban complexity. Architecture and urban design, Mafia games nailed the visual aesthetic. Chicago during this era was a mix of stunning Art Deco skyscrapers emerging alongside working-class neighborhoods. The game captures that architectural schizophrenia perfectly. Gleaming downtown buildings right next to industrial working-class zones. Economic landscape was wild. Chicago wasn't just a city. It was an economic battleground. The game shows this perfectly. We're talking about a place where economic mobility happened through multiple channels, some legal, most definitely not. Population dynamics. The game accurately represents the massive demographic shift. Chicago in the 1930s was experiencing massive immigration waves. Predominantly European immigrants, Italians, Polish, Irish, were literally rebuilding urban economic structures. The game's diverse character representations? Historically spot on. Transportation infrastructure. Those vintage cars and street designs? Historically meticulous. Chicago was transitioning from horse-drawn transport to automotive culture. The game captures that awkward, beautiful transition period where old and new transportation methods coexisted. Social segregation was real. The game subtly shows something profound. Chicago wasn't just a city, it was a complex social ecosystem divided by race, ethnicity, and economic status. Neighborhoods weren't just geographical, they were entire cultural universes. Industrial backdrop. Chicago was basically America's industrial heart. Meatpacking, steel production, manufacturing, the economic engines that powered the nation. The game's industrial zones? They're basically historical documentaries in visual form. Prohibition impact. The game absolutely nails how Prohibition transformed urban landscapes. Speakeasies, underground economic networks, complex social negotiations, all perfectly represented. Chicago wasn't just experiencing Prohibition. It was essentially ground zero for the entire cultural phenomenon. Weather and environmental details. Even the seasonal representations are historically accurate. Chicago's brutal winters, the smoky industrial atmosphere. The game captures that gritty industrial aesthetic perfectly. Political complexity. The game shows Chicago as a political machine, which is historically accurate. We're talking about a city where political power was negotiated through complex social and economic networks, not just ballot boxes. Cultural diversity representation. The game captures something profound. Chicago wasn't a monolithic experience. It was a multi-layered cultural ecosystem where different immigrant groups were constantly negotiating social and economic spaces. Infrastructure transition. The game shows Chicago mid-transformation, not just architecturally but socially. We're talking about a city moving from traditional industrial models to more complex urban economic structures. Most games would simplify this. Mafia games? They're basically historical documents with extra action sequences. And we are done, and if you liked this video, please drop a like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you again. Till then, take care and have a nice day.